Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson. Let me introduce you to our regularly scheduled panelists. First, we have with us Mr. Todd McFarland, Deputy General Counsel for the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have Mr. Tim Schultz, who's the president of the First Amendment Partnership. We have Mr. Lawrence Brown, who's the Assistant Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty for the Northeastern Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we also have Dr. Tim Golden, who's a visiting professor of philosophy at Whitman College. Gentlemen, great having you here with us and looking forward to our conversation for today. You know, I had a chance to look at an interesting article the other day regarding Liberty University that's been told that they will have to pay $14 million for a violation under the Clery Act. Liberty University has agreed to pay an unprecedented amount of $14 million fine for the religious institution's failure to disclose information regarding crimes on its campus and for its treatment of sexual assault survivors. You know, the U.S. Department of Education made this announcement not too long ago, and this fine is by far the largest ever levied under the Clery Act, and obviously the largest ever levied on a, what I would call, religious university. The irony is that the Clery Act only comes into play because if you're an institution that, quote unquote, gains any federal dollars or state dollars or anything from taxpayers, that you are now in a situation where you now fall under this act. You know, Lawrence, when I think about activities that go on at some of our Christian universities, on one hand, they love the idea of believing that, well, you know, we're kind of on our own, we're private, we can do whatever we need to do. But here we are seeing one of our major, what I would call religious institutions, in a situation where now they're being levied one of the largest fines ever as it relates to a violation of an act that believably should be helping to what I would call protect more individuals. But on the other hand, do we have a combination of activities here that makes it a little bit difficult for private institutions to really claim that they're private?
Well, you know, the Clery Act was named after Jean Clery. She was a freshman at Lehigh University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And while a student there, she was murdered by another student. She didn't know him, had never met him before. He inadvertently ended up in her dorm and in her room trying to commit a robbery. And when her parents later discovered that the school had a number of violent crime incidents that they knew nothing about, they took issue with the fact that when they were scouting schools for their daughter in the first place, had they had access to this information, they could have factored it into the decision-making process as to whether or not they wanted to send her there or someplace safer. So when Liberty violated this provision of the act where you've got to alert people what's happening in your institution as it relates to violent crime, it really is it really is something that you have to take seriously, because the fact of the matter is, if your game plan is to cover up, deny, or just not talk about it, that seldom works as an effective strategy for dealing with issues like these. And the fact that the fine was so large, I think they were really trying to send a message that cover up and failure to report is never going to get you to a good place.
No, ironically, Tim Schultz, when you see this type of fine, there have been some that maybe even had surmised that the fact that this was probably a Christian institution, they may have decided that they were going to actually impose even a stiffer fine, you know, for reasons that may be unbeknownst. The real question is, when you have something like this that's taking place, and it doesn't seem like there was really any what I would call codification of how you get to these numbers, do we get a chance to even think, are we making sure that religious institutions are being treated as fairly as other institutions? Someone that surmised that this was Harvard, we would have never seen a number anywhere near that level.
I just wouldn't speculate on that. Look, religious institutions shouldn't be covering up crimes, especially sex crimes. And we know that they have, and that they've done this across different realms of religions. And there's no free exercise of religion right to cover up crimes. You know, there might be priest penitent issues within religions, that those things have to be safeguarded. But that's separate from knowing that crimes have been committed in your house and failing to protect other innocent people, which is what happened here. So I'm just not an expert on the policy of fine sizing under the Clery Act, but I would just say, somebody gets fined for this kind of egregious action, I have no sympathy.
Well, Orlin, I don't know if I have sympathy for Liberty, but I don't have any doubt in my mind that they were targeted because not just a religious institution, but one that took, a lot of pot shots at the administration it was done under. So I used to sit on the board of an undergraduate institution. I remember we got reports on Clery Act, and our, security teams and our leadership took it seriously. But the problem is, our Clery Act reporting showed us having multiple times more incidents than a large public university that was right next door. It was inconceivable that school's reporting was accurate. But did the Biden administration, the Justice Department, investigate that large state school? Absolutely not. They went after Liberty. So yes, Liberty should have followed this. I don't have sympathy. They were definitely a bad actor, but just because they were a bad actor doesn't mean they weren't targeted by the administration. And it's like, given my experience in an undergraduate institution, and by the way, that makes it hard because you're competing for these students and parents come and they're like, well, you have all these reports, this other school doesn't. And you're like, yeah, but that's just not believable. It just can't be true. But, that's a hard thing to explain. So I think the proper approach to this would be for the administration to start going after the Harvards, going after the large public schools where there clearly is shenanigans going on.
Well, Todd, I knew it was going to be difficult to get through a whole episode without disagreeing with you. But I should just say your experience on a board of a private institution, a private university notwithstanding, I don't think we should extrapolate from your experience that other private institutions or universities are targeted. The fact of the matter is you have to comply with the law. That when there is a law that requires reporting and that the reporting be accurate, you have to follow along with that. And if you fail to do that, and if you either fabricate your reporting or your reporting is inaccurate or your reporting results in an unsafe situation, which according to the story of the Clery Act is at odds with the act itself, which is supposed to create a safe environment, you have to deal with the consequences. And so
they absolutely should, but you know as well as anyone, Tim, that enforcement matters as much as the law, right? And if you don't enforce the law against politically connected state institutions and others, and you do only the private institutions, that's a problem. Listen, I'm not going to excuse Liberty. They clearly got out of this, weren't following it. My point was, why were they targeted and not other institutions that I think if you went through and looked at what they were doing have just as many skeletons in their closet? So yeah, Liberty should have absolutely followed this, but that doesn't excuse selective enforcement.
Well, I agree with you that Liberty should have followed it, but I'm reluctant to your language. It to me is troubling. Targeted. I don't know what that means. Again, you've had an experience and your experience was what it was, but I would need to see a lot more evidence along the lines of what you're talking about in a much more widespread, pervasive manner before I came to the conclusion that private schools, particularly private Christian schools, are being targeted, whereas large state universities are not. It seems to me that large state universities have a security infrastructure that is consistent with what the Clery Act requires. I'm not even so sure that a lot of private universities, as Orlin pointed out at the top of the segment, they think, oh, we're private, we can do whatever we want. And public universities who are accustomed to dealing with issues of public safety and concern for the public, they already have an infrastructure to deal with it. So your experience was what it was, but I would need to see a lot more evidence produced that private universities are being, quote unquote, targeted while public universities aren't. I just would need to see more along those lines.
Well, I think, Dr. Brown, when I take a look at this issue, I guess one of the points that Todd is making is that the numbers in and of themselves don't necessarily bear out. I mean, Liberty University does happen to be a very large school, 15,000 students, which is pretty large for what we would call a religious institution. But sometimes when you look at the numbers, where you got schools that have 60,000 students there and they end up having violations that are much smaller than a school that even has 5,000, it almost begs the question that something must be wrong here, because I don't think we got a societal change as we go from campus to campus, or maybe that is the case.
Well, but here's the problem. They have two black guys here, not one black guy. Yes, there was the failure to report, but even and perhaps more egregious than that is the clear indicators that said how they treated people who were victims of sexual assault. That's a real issue here. As a Christian school, or a quote unquote Christian school, if you are going to downplay and if you are going to mistreat people who are guilty of things that violate the word that you're supposed to be a proclaimer of, then that makes it even worse for you. I would tend to think that once that came out, that also helped to put them on the radar here.
So just to be clear, that's a different question than the Clery Act. It also, I want to point out, it puts universities, this is a much more complicated. First of all, please don't accept what some government bureaucracy said as being true. Like, this is the Department of Education. We've known they've targeted other Christian schools and so forth with Title IX investigations purely over their religious beliefs, nothing to do with sex, but just with their treatments. This is a politicized entity. But more importantly, where Liberty got into trouble, and other Christian schools have had the same issue, is when you have conduct standards, especially with no drinking, right? So what often happens is you get a report of sexual abuse, they investigate that. The person who's making the report admits as part of it, they were at an off-campus party and they were drinking. That's admitting to an honor code or quote Liberty Way violation. That puts the school in a very difficult position, because you have then the person reporting admitting, not following the school's code. What most universities have basically decided is that they're just not going to enforce that, which creates its own set of incentives and problems, but maybe a discussion for another day.
I would just add, Orlin, Liberty's annual revenue includes their online program. They had $1.6 billion of revenue in fiscal year 2022. So they settled this case. $12 million is not that much money. Sounds a lot of money for normal folks like us, but at Liberty, it's a drop in the bucket.
Well, I think at the end of the day, what we're starting to see here is the question of when you're a public institution versus a private institution from an academic standpoint. When you decide you want to take federal dollars in any form or fashion, these are the types of scrutiny that you've got to be on, even though you should probably be doing it without that hanging over your head. You know, an interesting case, Civil Rights Department of California versus Tastries. You know, this is another situation where you have a Christian and the owner of Tastries Bakery in Bakersfield, California. And this individual by the name of Cathy Miller has custom designed wedding cakes for over a decade. But a few years ago, California opened an investigation into Miller after she explained to a same-sex couple that her faith did not allow her to design their wedding cake. It's been about 6 years, and California has kind of repeatedly compared Miller's religious beliefs about marriage and racism and asserted that Miller's beliefs harm the dignity of all Californians. Meanwhile, Miller and her staff, they've ended up losing contracts, they've received death threats, and, been the victims of all kinds of harassment. Todd, it seems as though we've been talking about, these type of cases as it relates to weddings and individuals who have artistic abilities, that they make decisions on what they want to do and what they will do based on their quote unquote Christian beliefs. It seemed as though this would have been somewhat subtle, but this looks like it's going to be something that keeps coming up over and over again. And obviously we know that no factual set of circumstances are identical, but it appears as though we're going to be fighting this battle probably from state to state, maybe till the end of time. I mean, what's the real color behind this particular case?
It's a conflict of rights, Orlin. That's simple. You've got two very legitimate competing interests. You've got public accommodation laws. These come out of one of the most morally justified movements in the United States. The Civil Rights Act started with things like lunch counters, bathrooms, movie theater access, hotels, these sort of meat and potatoes civil rights era acts. And that has been rolled out and extended to other protected classes. And no one's wanting to see those advances pulled back. But competing with that is people's moral beliefs and how they use their artistic skills and abilities, and what happens when they use those for a particular conduct that they disagree with. And the challenge, of course, is, despite what we talk about, people say, well, that's not endorsement if you just bake a cake for that. Well, it is on some level. On some level, if you bake a cake that says, just to use the stereotype name, Adam and Steve, getting married and so forth, that is an endorsement level to some extent, because you can think of other situations where you are creating flags with, say, other, say, offensive terms that we all agree on. People would say, how could you do that? So I think, it is one of those situations where we have two very strong competing rights, and I think that's why we're still fighting about this years after, someone like a Jack Phillips and Masterpiece Cake Shop out of Colorado. I think that's been going on for at least 10 years now.
Yeah, I think this is, I have 2 points along these lines. First, I think to Todd's point, in terms of rights, I've always thought that this was more of a free speech issue than a freedom of religion issue. So that's one thing. But regardless of how you put it, as Todd, I think, correctly points out, there are these competing interests, and in a sense, that's what happens under American law. Rights are often in conflict. But I tell you, Orlin, what disturbs me more about this case is the behavior exhibited toward Miss Miller and the crimes that she has been victim of throughout this whole process. And what strikes me as a disturbing situation in this is that it doesn't seem like anyone has been held accountable for the crimes that they've committed against her. I mean, where is the prosecutorial end of all of this? No person should be a crime victim because of the beliefs that they hold, whatever those beliefs are. It's one thing for us to have beliefs and ideologies that we debate about and that we even litigate in court. But it's another thing to have your ideology legitimized by going out and committing crimes against someone without ever having to face the music in the criminal justice system. And I think that Miss Miller's own dignity ought to be recognized by criminal prosecutions of people who are way out of bounds in making her a crime victim. So that's what disturbs me most about this case, is that the prosecution or district attorneys seem to be very slow on investigating and prosecuting people responsible for doing her harm.
But Tim Schultz, one of the things that you hear the pushback is some people will say, okay, you've got these religious beliefs, but apparently you have probably hierarchies of sin that kind of, operate, and maybe it should be personal. Because then the question will be, well, if somebody is a liar, are you comfortable with making them a cake? If somebody's engaged in other activities that could be violative of the religious beliefs that you have, you may be comfortable making them a cake, or maybe you're not. But I guess the question is, do the courts have any right, or should they have any position in really trying to determine the sincerity of your real religious beliefs in an effort to try to find the line between protecting your religion or just engaging in discrimination?
Well, I think the courts have a role to play in determining whether you're sincere. That's totally right. I think the courts don't have a right to adjudicate this sort of ethical hierarchy that you just articulated. That is not their job at all. Now, I think as Christians, among Christians or among other faith groups, you absolutely can talk about whether conscience assertions are well-reasoned, whether they're morally and intellectually consistent, all of these kind of hierarchy of sin, questions, and participating in somebody else's sin questions. Those are the things people ought to talk to their pastors and their Bible studies about, right? And totally appropriately. I just don't think we want judges in American courts being the ones to make those calls.
Well, something, you have something else in this situation that I think compounds why it's such a bad outcome. Here, you have somebody who has not just grabbed a hot button issue, because that's what a lot of people do, right? There's something that they feel very strongly about, and they come out against it, and they're all rah rah sis boom bah. But in the other areas of their lives, they're very inconsistent. For example, you had the baker who didn't want to do a same-sex wedding cake, but when the question came up, well, what about somebody who's getting married for the second or third time? But here you had somebody who was actually being consistent. In other words, not only would she not do same-sex wedding cakes, she wouldn't do risque cakes. She wouldn't do gambling cakes. In other words, if it violated her Christian beliefs across the board, she was consistent about it. And she even said to the folks who came in, listen, because of my beliefs, I can't do this for you. But guess what? If you need it done, here's where you can go. So she was demonstrating a level of humanity that, I find commendable. And that's why for somebody like this to be treated the way she was treated, I think it just adds an extra layer of insult, because she wasn't trying to be that person. She wasn't trying to be despicable. She wasn't trying to demean anybody. She simply said, listen, this is where I stand. This is how I get down. But, if you want X, Y, Z, boom, here's where you can go. So, to see somebody like that mistreated this way and to not have it pursued and investigated, it sends a very troubling message.
And in Orland, as Elder Brown said, I think there's a couple of factors here that go into sort of these balancing of rights. I think, first of all, looking at, are the services otherwise available, right? Are we looking at a situation here like during the civil rights era where there was, you had to have the green book of, acceptable hotels to travel in the South if you were Black? Or are you looking at, sort of a more limited, sort of marketplace? Also, I think the essentialness of the services being provided, right? We're talking about wedding cakes here. This is not healthcare. This is not housing. This is not restrooms. This is something. And so I think those factors together, I think all sort of combined together, along with other issues, to say that, as Tim Schultz said, this is a sincere belief. It's not being done pretextual. There's other places this can be done. And I think the balance comes down on the side of the religious adherent here. As much as and the other individuals can get the cake somewhere else. Yes, there may be some dignitary harm that this person disagrees with them, but guess what? That's part of living a pluralistic society. People are not going to agree with your moral choices all the time.
Tim Schultz, what I'm trying to understand, though, is, and Tim Golden kind of started this conversation, why doesn't this whole argument fit much more neatly into a free speech conversation? The idea that you should be free to, to express yourself and however you see fit, which is kind of, the American way. I had a father who believed that weddings were so critical that if you weren't 100% in support of every aspect of what it is, you shouldn't be there. I mean, there were weddings I didn't go to. He's like, this guy doesn't have a job. We're not going to that thing. Let's everybody stay home. I mean, you got to develop your own priorities of what you're going to do. Why is this not, neater in that box, Tim?
Well, because you're talking about somebody who's engaged in commerce, and it's not 100% clear that cake baking or even custom cake creation is an act of speech. I think it is. I think it falls inside the line of speech, that people didn't have rights around that. It's a kind of work of art. That's not the way it was when I grew up in the 70s, Orland, but that's what that industry has evolved into now. Like tattoo artists, I think, are artists, right? They have a right to decline jobs if they don't want to get my Jesus tattoo. They don't have to do my Jesus tattoo, right? But I think that that's the reason it's tough, because I think that custom cake baking is not clearly artistic in the way that lots of other things are clearly artistic.
Well, Dr. Golden, when you think about some of this activity, is this the type of thing where society should be starting to push on this prosecutorial aspect that seems to not be happening here? It seems as though there may be more of a need that, even based on these type of cases, that there's more of an outcry in the public.
I think there should be. I think there's a lot of talk in these kinds of cases about dignity. The California authorities are talking about how Miss Miller's conduct is offensive to the dignity of all Californians, and yet Miss Miller's dignity has yet to be vindicated with a serious and vigorous criminal prosecution of the people who have assaulted her and stolen from her and threatened her. And so I think we ought to be outraged whenever someone is a crime victim and doesn't get the return from their tax dollars that support local district attorneys' offices, et cetera, that they ought to be receiving. So if we're going to be about dignity, we have to be about dignity across the board. And that means that Miss Miller's dignity has to be vindicated with a criminal prosecution that she pays for through her tax dollars.
And I have to let that be the last word, but I think you hit it right on the nose that there should be dignity for all that are involved at all times. Lawrence Brown, tell me something I don't know.
Over the last few years, violent criminal activity is down by over half on our college campuses. However, what many of the most serious crimes all still have in common, whether it's rape or sexual assault, 9 times out of 10, those crimes all have in common the fact that alcohol is involved. Students, leave the liquor alone. That story never ends well.
Wow. Tim Golden, tell me something I don't know.
I'm reading a wonderful book this summer, like I do every summer. It's my favorite novel, Don Quixote. And we tend to laugh at Don Quixote because he saw things that weren't there. He saw windmills and thought they were enemies and charged into them. And it's a lot of comic relief in Don Quixote. But when I think about it, I think about how powerful it is to see things that others don't see and actually believe in them. For the Christian, I think this is something we ought to seriously consider.
Wow. Tim Schultz, tell me something I don't know.
Crime is down in the United States over the last 3 years, but reports of crime are up. And crime statistics are really wonky. And so part of the problem is it's really hard to know what's true and what's not in this space.
Todd, tell me something I don't know.
We talked earlier about baking cakes. Jack Phillips, Masterpiece Cake Shop, that issue started in 2012 when the couple first came to him. It's 2024 as we film this. We've been fighting about cakes for 12 years with no end in sight.
Gentlemen, thank you for that information. It was great talking with you today. And thank you for being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.